Welcome back to the Futurists. And in the hosting chair today, you have, of course, myself, Brett King, and Rob Tercek, fresh back from his visit to the High Sierras, and some incredible photography there you got, Rob. So tell me about the...
all you got to do is point your camera. My gosh, everywhere you look, it's a spectacular view.
So you posted something today. What was that site you posted, the place you posted today on Insta, or was it yesterday?
Well, I went to Yosemite Valley, and then we hiked up to the High Sierras. We hiked up to Tuolumne Meadows, and for me, that was new. I've been to Yosemite a bunch of times, but I've never been up to the high part. That was spectacular, Brett. It was so beautiful. The weather was great. The sunlight is just so clear. The water is crystal clear. The lakes. And at night, the most interesting thing is up in the mountains, the sunset comes in sideways because the sky stays light for hours. So it gets darker and darker and darker around you. Like you need a flashlight to see where you're going on the ground. But the sky is light until 9 or 9:30 at night.
And it's like you can see the Milky Way stretched across the sky.
You can see stars for hours and hours. We saw satellites. We actually saw satellites go by. It's super fun to do that.
Wonderful what you can see with that light pollution. But I was actually referring to the Half Dome, right?
Oh, yeah.
So how high is that?
Oh, boy. I don't know off the top of my head. I would say it's probably 8,500 feet.
Right.
It's steep. And the last 400 feet is sheerly, it's like a bare granite face. A woman just died there, unfortunately, a couple months ago, because it's quite slippery. And when it's raining, the Park Service says, don't go. But people wait in line. They get a lottery, they have to join a lottery to get it passed just to go up the thing. And so she was determined to do it. And then on the way down, unfortunately, she slipped. And there's nothing to stop you from falling. So she just went. Yep. So downside.
No, that's a real upper for the show. Thanks, man.
Sorry about that. Well, you asked. It was a live topic there. The amazing thing was how crowded it was. Our U.S. parks now get 350 million people a year in the U.S.
Wow.
That's people from all over the world. There were Russians and Italians hiking with me this past week. And of course,
the one thing I mean, I don't know if this happened to you, but when I did Nepal earlier in the year and I did that flight around Everest, it was like hyper reality.
Yeah.
The size of it is almost too big for your brain to comprehend.
True.
Was that sort of the sense you got?
Yeah, it's true. Also, particularly with Yosemite and Everest, we've seen pictures of it a million times. So you sort of look at it and you go, oh yeah, there's that iconic image. And then your brain goes, but wait, I'm here. And it's so much bigger, and so much more immense and more vivid. Also, the light changes constantly, and it's it's a beautiful show to watch. It's like the highest high definition reality you can imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, frankly, it's funny to compare it to electronics because you realize what a thin verisimilitude there is with the electronic representations.
Not the same. Well, maybe with like stereoscopic, cameras like, Vision Pro type tech, but even then,
I kept saying it was the best virtual reality I've ever experienced in my life.
Yeah, I hear you. All right. Well, listen, let's get into the show. We have an amazing guest this week, Terence Mauri. He is a futurist and the author of an upcoming book. No doubt another bestseller for him, The Upside of Disruption. Terence, welcome to the Futurists.
Hey, Brett. Hey, Robert. Great to be on the show. How's it going?
It's going great. It's good to have you, Terence. Thanks for joining us today. Where are you joining us from?
Today, I'm in London. I'm in sunny London.
Oh, how about that?
There's a bit of a heat wave here at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be happening for a while, probably for the next 100 years or so.
Exactly. It's getting warmer by the year.
Yeah. So I want to get into the book, but let's start with, obviously, you've made the journey to become a futurist. Not a dissimilar path to what Rob and I have. You're working on your fifth book is about to be released on September the 4th. Is that correct?
That's it. Yeah, September the 4th, The Upside of Disruption.
And what's the URL for the book, or how we go about pre-order?
So my website, terencemauri.com or amazon.com, Barnes & Noble. Right. These are great go-to
wherever good
sites.
Books are sold.
Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
But before we start, before we get into the book, let's talk about your path to becoming a futurist. So when did you know you wanted to be a futurist, or what was was there a specific moment or a driver that put you in on this path?
Breton, I'm an accidental futurist. And what I mean by that is I had my whole life mapped out in a very linear way. I was working in consultancy, and one day I walked into a store and a car driver outside lost control, mounted the curb, and drove his car into the store. It was a terrible accident. Many people got injured that day, and I woke up under the car with a tire burning on my leg. I was in hospital for about 3 months. And, during that time, lots of time to think, to reflect, to really look at my values at a deeper level. And there's that saying by Steve Blank, the famous innovator, get out of the building to be innovative, to see the world differently. And I think having a few months to really go inwards made me realize I could no longer work in the world of consultancy. And that became my calling to move into the field of futurism, although I didn't really have a clear description of that at the time. So accidental would be the key takeaway.
And so, on that path, as you said, accidental futurist, but now, you make a living out of being a futurist. So, talk about that transition. When did you sort of figure out you could do this as a job, and what was the foundation of that? Like, did you look at any particular methodologies or in terms of like upskilling yourself for this?
I think one of the key learnings, reflections, is this idea of ecosystems of trust and ecosystems of excellence, ecosystems of networks. And of course, working in consultancy had allowed me to build those in an expansive way. And then off the back of that, I was able to form a number of partnerships with business schools all around the world. And this is going back around 17 years. And off the back of that, was able to launch a think tank called Hack Future Lab that today maps out disruptive trends impacting every vertical on the planet, really providing clients and individuals and organizations, educational institutions, policymakers with different types of frameworks to really look at inflection points and ask this question: how do we turn these mega trends into milestones? What are the sweet spots between sustainability, strategy, and profitability? And how do we stay resilient when the only constant is change? And so these are the sorts of questions that I'm asking with my teams to help organizations to lead from the future, not the present.
How would you compare this to consulting? So you started your career as a consultant, and I've done a fair bit myself of consulting. And management consulting is generally facing problems that exist right now in an operation, but there's also a future component. So tell me how that's different if you're a futurist.
I think it all starts with imagination. And so this is idea that everything starts as an act of imagination. To start a new business, it starts as an act of disruption, self-disruption in a way. But to sustain vitality for the future, we should be good at practicing reimagination. But it's a massive institutional blind spot. We're lousy at that. And I define reimagination as this capacity, this curiosity to see different possibilities, to see different scenarios, to see different futures, but also the courage to unlearn some of the old paradigms and assumptions about the world that have gone off like the yogurt in the fridge. And so my positioning, my framing is this idea of imagination and reimagination. It's a source code for future readiness. It's a source code for pro-resilience, but we're really lousy at it, as I said. If I look at the US tax code, it's gone from 400,000 words to 4 million words. There's over 100,000 different configurations of Starbucks. And I recently worked with a bank who confessed to me they're called How Simple Becomes Complicated. That's an acronym. And that will you'll be able to work out who it is. I can see Brett go through his mind.
That was good. How simple becomes complicated. Leave it right there. So I want to come back to the word you use, a key word, which is imagination. And what I notice is in large corporations, that's in scarce supply. Entrepreneurs are very imaginative. Entrepreneurs spend their evenings, even at nighttime, they're thinking constantly about possibilities and new ideas. And when they see something that works, somebody else is doing, they're happy to steal the idea or borrow the idea or integrate it into their own plans. But managers of big companies get there by sticking to the program. Think of a big auto company or a big pharma company or a big healthcare company, for instance. If you succeed in those companies, it's because you've been tried and true. You've stuck to the path that works. You've been a good corporate citizen. You've complied by a set of rules. You've managed within their process. You haven't challenged the system in any way. And now let's suppose you've risen through the ranks and you're one of the leaders in that company and you're facing a disruption of the entire landscape, but all you have to fall back on is the old tried and true. Now, this is probably the kind of customer that you deal with, the kind of client that you deal with. How do you help somebody inside of an organization that has only complied with the policies of the business? How do you help them reignite their imagination?
It reminds me of a client who said to me, we spend too much time on changing policies and not enough time on changing mindsets.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this mindset gap in most organizations. And I think one of the biggest opportunities and challenges for a post-AI world is an organization that can rethink and unlearn and scale imagination in a meaningful way, a culture of imagination, a culture of curiosity. The culture of curiosity embraces ideas, new ways of thinking that challenge the status quo. Cultures of conformity are the norm, though. They reject ideas that challenge the status quo. And I worked with one of the world's
people. They reject the people,
and they
who
reject the
bring new
people
ideas,
as well.
Yeah.
They reject the people as well. So I think one of the biggest risks right now that every organization, every leader, big or small, profit or non-for-profit, is facing right now is that we always overestimate the risk of doing something new, trying something new, a new business model, leveraging AI in a bold, responsible way, winning the war for talent. So we always underestimate the risk of doing something new. But we always overestimate the risk of doing something new and underestimate the risk of standing still. And so in this age of, where everything is the slowest it'll ever be, AI is the slowest it'll ever be, actually not taking a risk is a risk. And so I'm helping organizations to really overcome what I call this paradox of risk, that the less you take risks, the more risky it is.
Yeah, I see that. I get that. I wonder if people understand that concept. Sometimes
The
making
biggest risk you can take is not doing anything at all, right?
Yeah.
Especially
Yes.
in a dynamically changing environment. That's definitely. I mean, I used to have this conversation about technology adoption disruption, right? The technology adoption curve we always see. Like it took this long for printer. I mean, for the printing press, and this long for the fax machine, and this for the microwave and TV, and then you got Facebook and open, Chat GPT at the other end, right? And when you look at that, you realize that technology disruption is just a constancy. It's a fact of life. And why any industry could look at that 300-year cycle of technology disruption and think they're immune to it, it just blows my mind. But you see it. Like I've done a lot of work in the banking industry. You mentioned, Terence, you've been doing some work with a bank recently. That's a great example. They're making some incremental changes, but all of the activity is happening with the new entrants.
I call it the peanut butter strategy or peanut butter thinking. And the idea is we spread the peanut butter too thinly over multiple projects. A lot of them are vanity projects, and we lack that focus to actually really get ROI, not just return on investment, but this kind of new post-AI human metric that every leader should be thinking about, which is return on intelligence, return on imagination, and return on ideas. The paradox, the challenge, is that technology changes fast, humans don't. E.O. Wilson, a great philosopher, said, we are trapped in Paleolithic brains, medieval institutions, godlike technology. What could possibly go wrong? Tristan Harris at the Humane Center of Technology talks about this wisdom gap, that the speed of change and the speed of complexities that are interconnected, overlapping and accelerating is outpacing our Paleolithic brain's ability and capacity to respond in a meaningful way. And we're seeing that manifest in so many ways. And I think this is a risk, but also an opportunity for humans to rethink and go beyond this kind of incrementalist approach to a more transformative approach.
The topic of increasing complexity is a good one. It's super relevant right now because it's not just technological complexity. That's certainly one big factor, economic complexity, but there's also demographic complexity. And now weather complexity because of climate change. And these are too many factors for anyone to really get their head wrapped around. So for this reason, we need assistance. It's a great time to have artificial intelligence. It seems to be arriving just in the right moment. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, but this will be an intelligence tool in the sense it helps us make better decisions in a complex world.
Yes.
Okay,
And I think, sorry,
challenge
I
that
think,
a little bit.
a great question. A great question we should all be asking ourselves is, are we complexifiers or are we simplifiers? Because the truth is, when I ask leaders around the world that question, 99% put their hands up and say, well, we're complexifiers. I think the opportunity with AI is to actually fight complexity with simplicity. But we also need to avoid artificial idiocy, artificial intimacy as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So now there's a little bit of backlash against artificial intelligence, partly because there's been so much hype in the last 2 years. And also, let's say, there's been a bubble of investment. There's a tremendous amount of funding that's gone into the space with not very much return on investment. And so, Microsoft has indicated they're going to increase their investment in, their CapEx investment in infrastructure by a factor of 100. Google's increased theirs. They've doubled their infrastructure investments, so they're scaling up for massive AI models, but yet they haven't yet indicated how they're going to make money on this. And it's a 600 billion to $1 trillion problem. And the question hasn't been answered. Where is the revenue going to come from? Now, the tech companies will tell you it's going to come from every industry. So you're going to take a percentage across every single industry. And of course, there's a 40-50 trillion dollar economy. So there's plenty out there for them to get their gain. But we have yet to see the productivity gains or the efficiency gains that have been heralded. And that's causing some problems for smaller companies right now. There's quite a few small AI companies that got a big start a couple of years ago, raised a bunch of cash, and now they're looking to exit prematurely because they don't see a path forward. What's your take on that as a person who's focused on disruption and helping established companies utilize AI to deal with disruption and complexity? Have you seen the results yet? Do you see promising areas for application of AI? Do you know where we're going to get the ROI on AI?
I mean, I have to mention Eric Schmidt. He's been in the news recently, former CEO of Google, and he said, the pace of change in the next 2 years will be so much faster than the last 2 years. He thought 6 months ago, one of his assumptions was that the future was going to be frontier AI companies. He said a couple of days ago he's no longer sure if that's going to be the case. So the speed, the pace of change is truly overwhelming. And I think we need to get back to fundamentals and first principles and ask some catalytic questions that don't just make us feel good, but make us think hard. For example, how do we align AI to serve the best interests of humanity in a bold, responsible, ethical, inclusive way? Right. That would be one for me. The promises and perils of AI and the story of AI are still being written. Will it be a democratizer or a disruptor or some type of dystopian golem minding us of our humanity? I think there are still more questions than answers right now. The promises of productivity are very high, but I invoke Solow's computer law, which is another interesting paradox, which is investment in IT has always gone up, but it has not always translated into productivity. We have a productivity paradox where actually, for many, Microsoft's recent workforce index study showed that over 100,000 managers around the world, 66% of them said they don't have enough time in the day to do their day job. So this is an interesting paradox for us to continue to discuss after the break.
All right, cool.
Great. Speaking of the break, before we go to break, we always like to do one thing here with our guests, which is a rapid fire series of questions. Here you just give your first impulse answer, and my colleague Brett is going to administer the poison. So brace yourself, because this, my friend,
keep it clean, Brett. Round.
Get ready for the lightning round. All right. What was the first science fiction or futurist story you remember being exposed to on TV or via books?
Isaac Asimov, Frank Herbert, obviously Dune. And what else? H.G. Wells as well.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, classics.
Yeah, I was talking about The Journey to the Center of the Earth. I think that's that original, 1956 movie, or it's very underrated. But anyway, what
Yes.
technology has most changed humanity, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a good one. I think penicillin, if we go back to the
Mm.
1930s, 1920s, I think penicillin, definitely antibodies, medicine. These are the Cambrian moments for humanity, because otherwise we'd be still dying before the age of 30.
Yeah, we had a good chat with David Brin about Jonas Salk's role in, with vaccinations too. So that was
Yes.
interesting. All right, name a futurist or entrepreneur that has influenced you and why.
Yeah, great. So Hala Hanna, executive director at MIT, and she's pioneering a faculty at MIT called Solve. And the mission of Solve is to create a generation of solvers around the world, working with the next generation of entrepreneurs. So I recently met a lady called Emma Yang. She's only 19 years of age. She scaled an app called Timeless using AI, geotagging, facial recognition to help those with Alzheimer's. She's received $1 million worth of investment. And this idea of Generation Solve, harnessing the power of AI, is what gives me hope in the future.
Good. Well, that leads into our last question as well. So, is there a science fiction story that's most representative of the future that you hope for?
That I hope for.
Yeah. Or that you think is realistic?
I think the one that's most realistic for me is Blade Runner.
That's not what you hope for, though.
Right now.
Original Blade Runner or the newer version?
So yeah, so I think where we're at right now is I think the would be the Blade Runner.
Fair
Wow.
enough.
Okay.
All right. Well,
grim dystopian look at the future.
You're listening to The Futurists. We're going to take a quick break, hear from our sponsors, and we'll be back with Terence Mauri.
Okay, we're back from the break, and you're listening to The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with Brett King, and this week we're talking to Terence Mauri. Terence is an expert in the subject of disruption. And he actually told us earlier in the show that you have to think about disrupting yourself. Terence, you've got a new book coming out next month, very soon, in just a couple of weeks. So tell us a little bit about the new book. What's the title?
Thank you, Rob. It's called The Upside of Disruption. And the big idea behind it is that, as humans, we crave the comfort of certainty. It's like a warm blanket. But up on the other side of disruption is learning, growth, discovery, possibility. And we're lousy as human beings at discovering that because we're primed for certainty, primed for safety. And so that's the hypothesis of this book, this idea, which I mentioned before, that we overestimate the risk of doing new things and underestimate the risk of standing still.
I like the cover of the book because you took the UP out of disruption and moved it up to the words upside to create upside. So it's like you peeled out those two letters and stuck them in front of side. The Upside of Disruption, and that'll be in stores in the US and the UK in September.
So yes, September the 4th.
Cool. And now, when you work with clients, what percentage of the organizations that you advise are actually literally facing a disruption? Is it all of them?
100%.
Oh, really?
I mean, 100%, and at a different scale, at a different speed, a different level. But that disruptability at an individual level, an enterprise level, is the highest it's ever been. And the numbers kind of tell the story as well. So in the new book, 93% of business leaders around the world across every vertical expect significant disruption to their business models over the next 5 years, although only 33% said they had the right mindsets, cultures, and capabilities to respond to disruption and turn it into a tailwind for laser-like focus and sustainable value creation.
It's a really good point. Not everybody in a company is prepared for dealing with rapid change. And not only that, not everybody in a company has the mandate to do that. You've got to have some people who are there to keep the lights on and keep the motor running, even if other people are steering the ship. Now, the concept of increasing change or accelerating change, that's been around for quite some time, since since the early 70s. But Ray Kurzweil gets a lot of credit for it with his book, The Singularity is Near, which is almost 25 years old. That book has been around for a long time.
He's got the new one out now.
Yeah, he
does. We should try and get him on the show, actually.
Yes,
revised version of that book. Is that your perception, Terrence? Are you seeing accelerating change? The point that Kurzweil made is that the rate of change itself is accelerating. So it's not just that we're having more change, but the changes are coming more fast, more frequently, and at an accelerating pace, meaning that no human on the planet is really fully prepared for the level of disruption we're experiencing. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, 100%. You know, the history of humanity is a history of disruption. 100,000 years ago, we harnessed fire, led to language. 175 years ago, these big innovation platforms, electricity, automobile, telephone, that really rewrote how we work and created value. And today we're at this new inflection point, these converging platforms, blockchain, energy storage, AI, robotics, DNA sequencing, that could potentially add trillions of dollars to global equity market capitalizations. Even job titles are being disrupted. So I recently was at the Department of Trade, exchanged business cards. I had to do a double take, head of uncertainty and scenarios.
I love that.
Listen, I'm not making this up, guys.
It's like the director of special projects all over again,
Wait,
right?
The head of certainty or the head of uncertainty?
Head of uncertainty and scenarios.
Wow.
I just thought, wow, this is unbelievable. And another one was distraction prevention coach.
Wow. Oh, those are great titles. You know, it's an interesting thing you bring up certainty and uncertainty, because this is really at the core of a world of accelerating change. There are no certain bets anymore. All there are is a range of probabilities, and you have to do your very best to do scenario planning and sort of estimate the likelihood of a future probability coming true. Do you do that with your clients? I find that that's a part of my work that they value very much, mostly because they're not in the habit of doing that. Most companies tend to work with the principle of, well, we'll just do last year's business next year, but we'll add 5% in budget and hopefully hit the target revenue number. And that's just not going to work anymore because the landscape seems to be shifting. How do you help companies prepare for future scenarios?
I think it's scenario planning, but even more than that, it's storytelling, actually articulating in a really crisp, concrete way different stories and different narratives, from preferred to plausible, right through to emergency or worst case scenario. And I think a key point here is that we're very good at planning, but we're not very good at storytelling, thinking about different stories of the future, and then scaling back and avoiding what I call the tragedy of the horizon. That this idea, this kind of blind spot that we're trapped as nowists, we're trapped in the now, the quarterly earnings reports, for example, and to really pull that, pull this sort of horizon back and don't get trapped in the tragedy of the horizon, which is really a nowist rather than a futurist. We obviously need to scale between both.
Mm-hmm. And in my experience, there's some pushback against this concept. I think partly it's because we've been hearing about disruption for nearly 30 years, ever since The Innovator's Dilemma became a popular book in the 90s. In some respects, there's disruption fatigue, where people say, well, hang on a second, there are people out there in Silicon Valley who are just into disruption for the sake of disruption. It's like young punks who throw a brick through the window of a department store. It's easy to smash a plate of glass. It's very difficult to make a plate of glass. So is it a question of disruption and managing disruption, or is it a question of establishing new institutions and new policies in a changing environment? And the first one's quite easy, dealing with disruption. Oh, smash it, break it up. The second one, on the other hand, requires considerably more forethought and planning, this idea of establishing new institutions. I don't think we're very good at that.
We're not very good. And for me, it's number two. It's this idea that the future isn't just about technology or trends. It's about mindsets. It's about choices. It's also about unlearning, which sounds counterintuitive to many, but unlearning some of the old paradigms, the old ways of thinking that no longer serve us and serve the future. And, you're right. We're suffering from disruption fatigue, transformation fatigue, agility fatigue, AI fatigue. The problem is all of these concepts
we're not going to get a rest
buzzwords.
From that. Yeah, we're not going to get a rest from that.
Yeah,
right?
we're not going to get a rest from it.
Yeah.
We're drowning in hype and hysteria to the point where actually Cal Newport at MIT has got a great new book out called Slow Productivity. It talks to us about this idea of, are we getting enough nutritional value from our information? And actually we're not. If you think about ultra-processed food, what about ultra-processed information? One of the risks is that with you're getting over flooded with information, disinformation, our calorific intake is going to go right down. It's going to be ultra processed information. And we're going to pay a cognitive tax, an emotional tax, a human tax on that. That's what's keeping me awake at night right now.
All right. So I mean, we have this philosophical change required, right? Because that short-termism or nowism, as you call it, is now being a problem. Because if we look at the problem we have of climate change right now, the problem with nowism is everyone says it's not a problem now. Let's wait to see if it's real. But by the time it's real, and we're at 2 degrees Celsius higher than the pre-industrial average, by that stage we're talking about 1 billion plus deaths, probably, right, from climate impact. So, how do we get humans off this nowism? How do we engender a culture that it's because I think this is the whole growth versus degrowth sort of economic argument as well. How do we say? We like Club of Rome, we talk about that frequently, all of those things, but how do we just change that culture, do you think?
I think we've got to really stretch time horizons beyond 5 or 10 years to 1,000 years, because by doing that, you really disrupt this imagination muscle that's fossilized and stagnated over the last 200 years. We need to pivot from an industrial mindset, preservers of the status quo, doing the same thing, to challenges of the status quo, and from a kind of fixed mindset to iterative mindset. So I think 1,000-year timelines really focuses the mind and forces you to rethink in a completely different way, forcing you to ask the types of questions that perhaps you've never asked before, and forcing you to ask yourself one big one: are we thermostats or thermometers? So what I mean by this is we've got thermostats and thermometers. A thermometer just reacts to the environment. Temperature goes up, temperature goes down. It's reactive and it's a nowist. A thermostat has an anticipatory muscle. It looks ahead. It's really a co-pilot in the environment. It's taking some sort of stake. And so the point here is asking yourself like this question as a metaphor: thermostat or thermometer? A thermostat is really about pro-resiliency. It's about thinking ahead before problems become emergencies. And I've seen this recently with one of the world's biggest luxury companies. They've done a partnership, entered into a partnership with Myco Labs, creating an alternative to leather called mycelium-based leather, a sort of mushroom-based leather. And they want at least 50% of their profits to come from mycelium-based leather by 2030. This is an example of leading from the future, not the present.
That's a cool idea. That sounds exciting. I wonder how well this message lands with big corporations. The average tenure of a CEO at a big corporation is about 3 years. The average lifespan of a corporation, as we all have talked about in the past, is shrinking every year. It used to be about 30 years. Now they're shrinking down to about 15 years. So does anyone in a corporation really have an obligation to think in a 1,000-year cycle, Terence, or should they be focused on the next quarter like they currently are?
This is the paradox and this sort of restless demands, which is we have this restless commitment to actually executing for today's world, but also an eye on tomorrow's world and reimagining for tomorrow. And I think it's a conflict, but also it's a paradox that we have to try and reconcile. Is that easy to do? No, it isn't. But this is a call to reflection, a call to reimagination. And actually, the alternative is very dystopian if we're not prepared as societies to start rethinking and unlearning some of the old ways that are completely obsolete for humanity.
All right. Well, let's dive into that. Let's talk about this transition. Because
what's an obsolete way of thinking?
Messy.
I would love an example of an obsolete way of thinking. Can you give us a for instance? Like how do you help people become aware that their way of thinking is obsolete, and what do they discard and what do they get in replacement?
Yeah. So, for example, I think, going back to this idea of complexity and bureaucracy, we're addicted to bureaucracy. We use it to get worth from what we do, define value, and often we're measured and rewarded through our work on bureaucratic work rather than intelligent work. And so, for example, an example here would be a reductionist mindset, instituting that. So, what can we do to fight bureaucracy with simplicity? And so reductionist mindset would be, for example, once a quarter, doing a kind of the equivalent of a Marie Kondo, detoxing, decluttering, deleting all that unnecessary bureaucracy to free up bandwidth to focus on the future, the higher value work. This is not easy to do. It's an institutional blind spot. We're hardwired to focus on bureaucratic outcomes rather than intelligent, fluid outcomes. But this would just be one simple example of kind of reductionism rather than being complexifiers.
Okay, as Brett said, let's think about the future then. So assuming that we do adopt a 1,000-year mindset, take us there. What should we think about? How can we conceive of the world 1,000 years from now? What will be different in society? What will be different with our natural resources and our environment? How will the economy change?
I mean, it's what a fantastic question. I mean, this is why
you put it there, my friend. I'm just feeding it right back to you. Go for it.
Can I bring in Ray Kurzweil at this point?
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
the first thing I want to say is two things. Number one is the power of catalytic questions, which is what you've just demonstrated, Rob. And at MIT, catalytic questions are completely underutilized in society. A catalytic question is a question we haven't asked before, or a question that really stretches the possibilities, stretches the imagination, that is what I call a beyonder. Don't limit our challenges, challenge our limits. And this is a great example of that. Questions that don't just make us feel good, but make us think hard. Number two, if we fast forward 1,000 years, well, first of all, what I would love to see, and is this idea of a completely decarbonized net zero world where we have urbanization has gone down. We have the 70% of nature that's been wiped out, biodiversity has been replenished. We have what's called a regenerative circular economy that really prioritizes what I call click values: clean, lean, inclusive, and circular. We have a world that really focuses not just on profit maximization and efficiency and speed, because that might be great.
You think capitalism is still going to be here in 1,000 years?
I doubt it. I don't think so. I think there'll be a next evolution of capitalism. I think there'll be some sort of like humanistic human maximization. And what that looks like, I can't say with with real detail. But what excites me about the future, whether it's 100 years or 1,000 years, I think the opportunity is to not just focus on profit maximization and efficiency, but to go post-capitalist to human maximization, where we're flourishing, where we're doing what the late psychiatrist Oliver Sacks spoke about, which is the 3 B's of livelihood: belonging, believing in something, belonging, feeling part of something bigger than yourself, and becoming, a state of perpetual beta. In Japan, they call it henka, and it takes its inspiration from nature. It means continuous evolution.
I like that idea. I think if I were to take a shot at the 1,000-year question, the first thing I would posit is that we're going to continue some trends that are present today, but they may seem small, and you have to kind of use your imagination, to use your point, to envision them, at their fullest extent. One of those trends is the merging of machine and man. We already do this today. People have prosthetic limbs, they have hearing aids, we have contact lenses and so forth. And all of those things are being digitized and networked and so forth. So we're already starting. Second, you have things like Neuralink, where we're going to start to hook up our brains to machines. We've had Dr. Philip Alveda on the show. He was one of the innovators of the cortical modem for the brain. That was a theory just 5-10 years ago. Now it's a practical reality that you'll be able to connect your mind. That's the first idea, is that we're going to merge more and more with machines. I think we already do that to some extent, but it'll be much more integrated into our biology. The second thing is programmability, the idea that we can program nature. And we've interviewed synthetic biologists on this show, like Andrew Hessel, for instance. Super fascinating topic for me, the idea that you can program cells the same way you can program a computer. Though DNA is a quadrinary language, it's not a binary language, it can be programmed. We've demonstrated that already. And in fact, most people have experienced it during COVID with the vaccines. Those are a byproduct of synthetic biology. I think you'll see that increase as well. And what that points to is a third trend, which is more harmony with the natural environment. As we integrate more and more of our technology and more of ourselves into biology, and we start to manage biology and manage process, we're going to start to assume the role of custodian for the environment, and we'll have to manage that perhaps in a more in a better way. And then the fourth thing I would think about is connectivity. We talked about it, you mentioned it a moment ago. I would say one of the big shocks socially for all of the societies around the world has been hyperconnectivity. And the turning point here was the rollout of smartphones and 4G connectivity, 4G wireless, just about a decade ago, maybe 12 years ago around the world. And what we saw was, first of all, billions of new people came to the internet, and they were all beginners. So it's like, beginner drivers on the highway. Suddenly there's a flood of new users. What do you know? And lo and behold, a lot of bad behavior because there aren't very many guide rules and so forth. So we had kind of a decade of tumult, and discord and, social media clashes and disinformation, all that. I think those are learning pains or growing pains. What we're learning how to do is think together. Now, if you take all these trends together,
collaborative intelligence. I mean, it's going to be collaboration between us and collaboration with AI, right?
There's some collective intelligence, cross-pollination of ideas at scale.
And the last piece we can also point to, and I think here there's very strong evidence that this is happening. Brett mentioned degrowth, and that's a fact now in population, at least in demography. You're going to start to see populations decline. It's already happening in China, South Korea, Japan, Russia, many parts of Northern Europe, but it's spreading. And the United States, the only reason the United States continues to grow is because of immigration, because we do not have enough children. Yeah. We're not having enough natural childbirths in this country to do replacement rate.
And yet immigration is not very popular right now.
But it's not popular.
And the pressure is going to increase.
Even if you look at the EU, and you look at the US, like the EU over the last decade, their GDP growth would have been 30% lower had it not been for immigration. The US is more like 15%, but still.
And the same in the UK.
Oh. That would put the US into negative growth territory, right?
But we're heading there, right? So we're heading there. Around the world, in the northern hemisphere, the average is about 1.7 or 1.8 in terms of children per couple. It's not enough. It's not enough to replace. You need 2.1 to be at replacement rate. So what we're going to experience, this is a demographic certainty, is degrowth in population. And then some people point to the southern hemisphere, particularly the continents of Africa, the subcontinent of India, and Indonesia as places where population growth continues. But what we already know is that as people move to cities, which now more than half the world population does, they stop having children. They have fewer and fewer children because they become very expensive to raise. And so we can imagine that's going to occur around the world. So let's assume then that in about 100 years, we start to see not just a flattening or a plateau in population growth, but a radical drop. And this is the one thing that's a big shock from my perspective, because our entire lives, we were raised with those UN forecasts, and we always saw that population would grow to, like somewhere around 2050, it would grow to like 10 billion people on the planet. We're on track to do that. That's correct. But what we never see is what comes after that. And what comes after that isn't just that it levels out or stays the same or grows slowly. It plummets because the factors that slowed down that growth, well, they continue and they compound. You have fewer children having fewer children. And as a result, within 2 or 3 generations, you're going to have a significantly smaller population. This has never happened since the Great Plagues, right? Since the bubonic plague 1,000 years ago.
I mean, we could recover from it, but
great news for the environment, right?
Yeah. But the problem, I mean, look at what happened with the environment during COVID. I mean, we can quickly turn this around, but everyone we have on the show that's a futurist talks about decarbonization. And of course, we talk a lot about, late stage capitalism, but it's like, we all know this has to finish. Why aren't we making this transition more aggressively? I mean, we are making some good progress right now, particularly with renewables and the next gen battery tech and things like that. But it's like, it's obvious. If you're going to future proof, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to decarbonize, right? And then you're going to look at value creation or collaboration that doesn't have an economic component the way we think of it today, right? And you're going to have to, if you're going to have a response to climate, it's going to have to be global collaboration. You know,
It comes back to these two final blind spots that we're all blind to, which is the tragedy of the horizon, which means we spend all our time as nowists, and the tragedy of the commons, which is we look around and go, well, everyone else is doing it, so I don't need to do it, or no one else is doing it, so I don't need to do it.
All the capitalists use the tragedy of the commons and sort of say it's all been fixed. We've had that before. It's like, no, look, you know, like it's pretty clear that capitalism, and you know, we should do more shows on this. We had Yanis Varoufakis come on and talk about this, but it just doesn't have the tools to respond. The free market can't fix the problems we have. In fact, honestly, the free market has created a lot of problems. You know.
Yeah.
So,
It's like they say,
Terence,
the guys who
we got to
created the
wrap.
problem aren't going to solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly. We got to wrap, but you know, let's just go back over. You know, so how can people sort of stay in touch with you? You know, where can they, you know, hear your latest musings, find out when you're on the road? You know.
Yes, thank you. So, terencemauri.com. Hack the Future is a podcast show that I have as well. Recent guest was Amy Edmondson. She's the author of a great new book all about reframing failure. And then, of course, LinkedIn as well. There's a flourishing community of courageous thinkers and doers on there that are trying to reimagine the future and create a future that we can believe in, that gives us hope.
Awesome. Great messages. Well, Terence, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Rob. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and let us know how the book works out.
Yeah,
thank you. All the best for it.
Great fun.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
All right, Rob. Over
well, it was good fun to have you this week. Thank you, Terence.
Yeah, thank you
for organizing it.
Yeah, thank you so much
for listening. For the folks who are listening, I want to give a big shout out. Thank you to our guest, Terence Mauri, and thank you for our crew, Kevin Hirschhorn, Lisbeth Severance, and the rest of the folks at Provoke Media who make the show possible. And we're also grateful to our fans and followers, the people who give us excellent feedback and suggestions. We keep hearing from people about the topics and the guests that they want to hear from. We love that kind of feedback. So thank you for sharing that with us on socials. Every week, we're going to bring you another expert, someone who's thinking about and acting to actively influence the future as it unfolds. And we are continually open to your suggestions for those guests. And we'll be back again next week. And until then, of course, Brett, you and I will see them in the future.